Hello everyone. In the last two videos, we have been talking about the fundamentals of phenomenology and the differences amongst different thinkers' positions on them. But today we are going to look at one of the practical applications of phenomenology. We are going to look at the famous Jewish thinker Viktor Frankl, who survived 4 concentration camps and then decided to dedicate his life to helping humanity. And interestingly enough, the core of his thinking is phenomenology. Usually, the public knows him as the writer of the remarkable book Man's Search for Meaning. But today, we are not going to talk about this book. Today, we are going to look at his another marvelous book entitled The Will to Meaning, in which he explains the foundations of his therapy that came to be known as logotherapy, which he initially called existential analysis. As we will go along, you would understand how phenomenology has influenced him throughout his life. Before all of that, a bit about his life, because his choice of profession was heavily influenced by his experiences. The most important period of his life that would go on to mark his life forever began in 1942, and that would suffice to understand his contributions to phenomenology and consequently psychology. In 1942, Frankl and his family were deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. His father perished there, and Frankl was later transferred to Auschwitz, where his mother was exterminated. His wife died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Despite the horrors he witnessed, Frankl observed that those who found meaning in their lives were more likely to survive. This observation became the cornerstone of his logotherapy. We could imagine, or perhaps not even that, how he would have seen his loved ones falling prey to death one after the other in the camps. And yet he somehow kept his nerves, especially his analytic fervor, intact during this time. We have already published a video in which we talked about another Holocaust survivor, Primo Levi. He did not choose the path of psychology as Frankl did. He focused more on the moral grounding of the explanations given regarding those who were drowned and those who were saved. He, like Améry and other Holocaust survivors, was more interested in understanding what happened and how was it possible that human condition could allow space for such an event. Whereas Frankl has one unique element in his writings. For sure, he is also interested in understanding what happened, but because of his direct contact with thinkers like Heidegger and Freud, he was able to employ his philosophical arsenal, specifically phenomenology, to derive an existential analysis that could help others apply his lessons in daily lives. That is to say, he builds his philosophy out of his tragic experiences in a manner that can be applied by everyone facing adversity. This was possible because once the tragedy of the Holocaust came to an end with the termination of the Second World War, Frankl returned to Poland where he became head of the neurological department at the General Polyclinic Hospital. His profession demanded from him practical applications at each step. Hence, he did not have the opportunity to hide behind theories that can only be discussed within the lecture halls and, moreover, must be left within the lecture halls. So, let's get to logotherapy. For that, we need to first understand how Frankl understands phenomenology. He defines the task of phenomenology in the introduction to his book, The Will to Meaning, with these words. Quote open. Phenomenology is an attempt to describe the way in which man understands himself, in which he interprets his own existence, far from preconceived patterns of interpretation and explanation such as are furnished by psychodynamic and socioeconomic hypotheses. Quote close. As stressed in previous videos, the main task of phenomenology that really compelled thinkers to take it seriously is to do away with the preconceived notions of interpreting a phenomenon. A phenomenologist is required to subtract the subjective mud from the phenomena under analysis, which by the way also necessitates him to keep out his subjective prejudices out of the analysis. But Frankl is more specific about the kinds of interpretation he wants to target in his study of existence. If you ask anyone to name three thinkers who changed the intellectual landscape of Europe in the 20th century, these are the names you would hear most of the times: Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Karl Marx. Of course, it is not certain that every single person will say these names, but you get the point. These three thinkers were themselves phenomena. Amongst them, it was Freud who contributed the most to psychology, or as Frankl calls it, the psychodynamic understanding of humans. Whereas Marx did his best to figure out the socio-economic side of humanity. And Nietzsche, it can be said, contributed to both psychology and sociology with his oeuvre. Now, what becomes interesting in Frankl's case is that he considers any theory of human psychology or sociology as reductionism. Throughout his writings, he engages with Freud. While disagreeing with him, he does give him the respect due to him. But there is one aspect that he is not ready to concede in Freudian psychoanalysis. And this is due to his phenomenological approach, i.e., the reductionism of human psyche into three poles: the id, the ego, and the superego, or the reductionism of all human motivations to repression or suppression of sexual kind. Frankl clarifies this again and again throughout his writing that any reductionism of humane phenomenon reifies human. That is to say, it makes a human a thing like table or chair. Since The Will to Meaning is the book in which he jots down the philosophical foundations of logotherapy, he mentions phenomenology on the very first page to distance himself not just from Freud, Jung, and others in this field, but to alert the reader that the correct phenomenological approach necessitates that no theory of human thought would be mentioned in the book. Therefore, he applies phenomenology to the foundations of psychoanalysis and other socio-economic theories to stress upon the uniqueness of human experience that cannot be reduced to any ism. He is so critical of this attitude that he terms it as a new form of nihilism. As he explains, quote open, "Today nihilism no longer unmasks itself by speaking of nothingness. Today nihilism is masked by speaking of the nothing butness of men. Reductionism has become the mask of nihilism." Quote close. What happens in any kind of reductionism? That is the question. Any theory of human psyche or any other human phenomenon excludes the factors that could challenge the theory. They become either assumptions or exceptions. Like in economics, we have the famous phrase ceteris paribus, but that is precisely the human condition. These assumptions and exceptions are precisely what make human subjectivity so rich and beautiful. And any psychoanalyst like Frankl, who has devoted his life to understanding and curing humans, cannot in principle assume some things and exclude all factors but the one he wants to cure. This is the challenge we are still facing today, because all these other factors that negate the theory or make it redundant are also responsible for the disease. We cannot throw them out of the window just because they disturb our neat and clean, objectively skewed theories. Here one must be reminded that just like Brentano, Husserl, and Heidegger, there is one thing common in Frankl as well: the skepticism and reservation in adopting scientific attitude to anything human. Following the founders of phenomenology, Frankl dismantles the supremacy of scientism in understanding human psyche, as he explains it here. Quote open. "The challenge is how to attain, how to maintain, and how to restore a unified concept of man in the face of the scattered data, facts, and findings supplied by a compartmentalized science of man." Quote close. After explaining this challenge, he provides a solution to it. And this is the solution that applies equally to all other intellectual domains where contradictions and ambiguity rules. Whether it be in brain sciences, philosophy of mind, psychology, or any other, you name it. Frankl's solution is what he calls dimensional ontology. Now, what's that? According to him, the ambiguity and contradictions in understanding human condition and everything related to it arise because specialists have the tendency to ignore the correct dimension in which the problem must be projected and studied. To explain this in simple terms, he gives the example of a cylinder which can only be properly pictured in 3 dimensions. But as soon as we project this cylinder sideways, it seems like a rectangle, and any analysis done on this rectangle would miss the correct analytic approach in studying the characteristics of the cylinder. For example, while studying the rectangle, we would be concerned with its area and mistakenly consider it to be the volume of the cylinder. On the other hand, if we project the same cylinder from its circular end onto the 2-dimensional plane, we will be dealing with a circle which is again a 2D figure. Hence, the projection of a cylinder whose analysis must be kept within 3 dimensions is now yielding us contradictory images of a rectangle and a circle. While we scratch our heads trying to analyze the 2-dimensional figures, we would waste our effort and energy into reaching conclusions that will give us only misleading conclusions. And the worst of all, we would not even have touched the main problem, let alone find its cure. This is the contradiction Frankl talks about. Now comes the ambiguity part. Imagine 2 spheres close to each other suspended separately in the air and we project them onto the floor. It is likely that we will get 2 circles intersecting each other in 2-dimensional projection. While on the contrary, there is no intersection in 3-dimensional projection. So for example, if we take the intersection to be the common ground between 2 different analyses, then we are mistaken to assume that there is some homogeneity between the 2, because in their original dimensions they have nothing in common. To make this example more concrete, which Frankl also highlights often in his writings, we assume that brain sciences that focus more on the biochemical understanding of the brain can provide all the solutions to our psychological anomalies. But we should ask Frankl that the scientific attitude is obsessed with either biological or psychological or both dimensions. So which one is the correct one? To answer this, he identifies a new dimension, which he explains in these words. Quote open. Dimensional ontology is far from solving the mind-body problem, but it does explain why the mind-body problem cannot be solved. Of necessity, the unity of man, a unity in spite of the multiplicity of body and mind, cannot be found in the biological or psychological, but must be sought in that noological dimension, out of which man is projected in the first place. Quote close. To compare this with the examples of figures he gives to explain dimensional ontology, what he is saying is that cylinder in 3-dimensional projection is the noological dimension, and the rectangle and square are biological and psychological projection. Noological dimension is what he calls the spiritual dimension, but not in any religious sense. It just means that man is a unity of material and non-material dimensions, and that the non-material dimension is the noological dimension. So the questions regarding morality and decision making are inquiries relating to the noological dimension. We must stop here for a while to relate this dimensional ontology with the phenomenological methodology that he proposes at the start. As Husserl and Heidegger before him emphasized that phenomenological approach is the best approach in determining the starting point, the fundamentals of any analysis. Through phenomenology, Husserl called into question the starting point of the analysis of consciousness. Heidegger, on the other hand, called into question the starting point of the ontological analysis. And Frankl here is calling into question the fundamentals of psychology and neurosis using the same approach. Therefore, We can see in these three cases how phenomenology is indispensable in determining the beginning of any research because it allows us to place the phenomena under analysis in the correct dimension without falling prey to the analytic framework of the past great thinkers, no matter how big their names may be. This is how Frankl formulates the pathway to his research. Phenomenology helps him to delineate the signposts along which he would proceed to explain his understanding of psychological neuroses. But the task of phenomenology does not end here. In fact, it begins from here. After clarifying these fundamentals, Frankl goes on to the intentionality thesis and derives some essential tenets of human condition that can help any psychoanalyst in formulating his own methodology. As we will see, he is leaning more towards Heideggerian ontological intentionality in his exposition. He explains his version of intentionality thus, quote open, existence is not only intentional but also transcendent. Self-transcendence is the essence of existence. Being human is directed to something other than itself. A truly phenomenological analysis would reveal there is no such thing as cognition outside of the polar field of tension established between subject and object. Quote close. According to him, it is the essence of being human to be directed as something other than itself. This is pretty much the basic principle of phenomenology, as we have talked about in the previous videos. But Frankl adds and underlines another aspect of human experience that results from this methodology: self-transcendence. This brings us to the two most important concepts in Frankl's writing: meaning and freedom. The best example to elucidate self-transcendence is through the phenomenon of love. When we fall in love with someone, we transcend ourselves and reach out to the beloved. This holds true especially when we consider our ideals. Let's say a young man is starting as a footballer. His ideal would be to shed away his own fragilities and transcend them towards the strength of a Ronaldo or a Messi or a Salah. Self-transcendence involves the capacity of a human being to take a stand on his own self and transform it with new meanings and values, thereby creating a new relationship with the self. And this is uniquely human. Animals cannot do it. This is why we have the famous saying that if you raise a lion cub in the hope that it would not eat you when hungry, then you are at fault, because a lion cannot transcend its carnivorous condition. But as Sartre said, man is condemned to be free. Freedom is in the essence of being human, and this quality stems from self-transcendence, which in turn stems from intentionality thesis. But here we get into that ancient debate about how much free are we from our conditions, whether they be social, biological, or political. To properly understand freedom, Frankl clarifies that, quote open, man's freedom is no freedom from conditions, but rather freedom to take a stand on whatever conditions might confront him. Taking a stand towards somatic and psychic phenomena implies rising above their level and opening a new dimension, the dimension of the neetic phenomena, or the noological dimension. In contradistinction to the biological and psychological ones, it is that dimension in which the uniquely human phenomena are located. Quote close. We do not have the freedom to choose in which country we are born or which native language we speak, etc. But we do have the freedom to detach ourselves from these conditions and choose our attitude towards them. So, for example, if someone is born in country X, that is out of his control, but what is under his control is pride at being born in country X. He can choose to be proud or ashamed of being born in that country. If we take this argument to the fundamental level and address the question of free will, we see that mostly those who are specialists in biology or physics claim that there is no free will. Everything is decided, and consciousness is nothing but atoms bouncing off each other in our body. This is the misrepresentation of the human condition because, as Frankl clarifies, this betrays the lack of correct dimensional ontological approach. These specialists reduce the whole panoply of human condition to physical atoms and explain human phenomena projected on the wrong dimension. Okay, so self-transcendence solves this problem of free will as well, at least for Frankl. But his description of intentionality further elaborates another important point, that self-transcendence is with the objective of meaning fulfillment. This he terms the will to meaning, from which also comes the title of the book. This is how he describes the will to meaning. Quote open. What I call the will to meaning could be defined as the basic striving of men to find and fulfill meaning and purpose. Quote close. He contrasts the will to meaning with Nietzsche's will to power and Freudian pleasure principle. The will to power is often misunderstood as the end to be achieved when it is actually just a means to the end. Furthermore, this mistake, which is very often made by humans of taking means as an end, arises from existential frustration. Frankl gives the example of money to elucidate this. He says that essentially humans want to will the meaning and live a purposeful life, and earning money is a means for that. But if after continuous effort the purpose cannot be reached, which was initially the end, the frustration leads to a kind of neurosis where means becomes the end. That is to say, if someone wants to get rich with the purpose of providing free education to the poor, but after habituating himself with earning money and facing obstructions in his project of education, he would reorient his self-transcendence towards getting rich and make it the end purpose. But now this person has fallen to the level of drives and ignored meaning, because drives push and meaning pulls. Earning money is not anything unique in this world. It is one of the ways to satisfy basic drives, which push us socially to do it. Whereas designating a meaning is different. As mentioned before, becoming a world-class footballer is a meaning that pulls one away from the indolence of the human condition steeped in animalistic drives. This is why Frankl postulates that meaning fulfillment always implies decision making. This capacity of decision making in itself betrays self transcendence. But this is half the story. The other half is more relevant to someone like a psychoanalyst or anyone who wants to better understand a human being. It is the importance of the context of the mental phenomena. Intentionality thesis highlights the importance of the polar tension between the subject and the object. There are two aspects to this polar tension: the situational context in which the subject intends the object and the objective pull of the intended object. The subject finds himself as the central pole on whom the situation impresses its demands or gives the context under which he experiences the intentional object, which in turn pulls the attention of the object towards itself, further influencing the subject. Any psychoanalyst who is dealing with the patient must not lose sight of the context under which the subject finds himself. Otherwise, we could only expect the same stupid explanations of somatic and biological nature that are with certainty presented as reasons or causes of the neurosis, when actually they are nothing but effects or symptoms. The contextualized understanding of the subject-object intentional relationship is necessary to have an appropriate dimensional diagnosis of the problem, according to Frankl. Because from this phenomenological relationship emerges meaning, as he explains it thus. Quote open. Meaning is what is meant, be it by a person who asks a question or by a situation which too implies a question and calls for an answer. Quote close. This is where Frankl's phenomenological approach intersects with the Heideggerian approach. Frankl claims that meaning is not invented, it is discovered, unveiled from within the situation. Or to put it more bluntly, nobody except for you yourself can figure out the demanding question of the moment and respond according to the quote unquote requiredness of the situation. And this requiredness is the objective quality of the situation, not a subjective imposition. If you see someone innocent drowning in the river, You need not go around asking people what is their subjective take on this situation, whether you should help the drowning person or not. It is a determined fact that if someone innocent is in danger, he or she must be saved regardless of who thinks what. Frankl stresses upon this objectivity of demand to dispel the criticism that his philosophy is close to idealism. Because, in the grand scheme of things, each one of us has a relation to the world, fundamentally speaking, and it is our task to discover authentic, true meanings within this relationship to improve this relationship. Establishing true and authentic meanings is the ultimate task of human being. And if someone is not able to do it, he or she can refer to logotherapy, which Frankl defines as nothing but healing through meaning. Thank you, everyone.